Paul Hogan of Sinn Féin, your mind isn't totally made up in that you're willing to put it out to consultation.
Well, I suppose the first thing in relation to the Constitution, as Charlie quite rightly said, the Constitution, Bunnock na hÉireann, was drafted in a shocked 1937. It's a much different world than 1937 that we currently have. There's a number of references within the Constitution in relation to, again, going back to the last point, the role of women in society, that they need not go into or need not benefit from, I suppose, financial gain. What we're saying is that what needs to happen is a new constitution based on the 32 counties of Ireland, bringing in advice from trade unions, civic society, the people to have their say on what kind of a constitution should govern this country.
Incidentally, not to get drawn on the 32 county matter too much, but is that as relevant today to the majority of people listening as it would have been, say, 30 years ago?
Well, I suppose the point, Will, is that if we're to put about a new constitution, that new constitution is to be here for decades upon decades. And I suppose from our own, and history comes about to repeat itself, that although the economy and the economy has every right to be, the number one issue on the doorsteps and the number one issue on people's minds, that I have no doubt that the national question will come back to be a serious question in the years ahead. We have only a couple of years to go before the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and I believe that the national question will be to the fore in that again. So what we need is a new constitution going forward that will, I suppose, encompass...
What is specifically wrong with the old and existing constitution?
Yeah, well, I believe that the old constitution is, mainly based on the influence of the church, and you only have to look at the preamble to the constitution and the various references within the constitution to God and to the church.
Sean Fleming, the Fianna Fáil argument is that 70 years of case law has built up, and that based on precedent and other legal mechanisms it's better to retain the existing constitution. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, we've never said we want whole-scale reform of the Constitution. It'd be very popular to say, let's throw out the Constitution and let's start from scratch. But, and it's easy to say that. But we're far more practical in what we're doing. A lot of good case law has been built up. A lot of good legislation has been passed. A lot of good legislation has been tested in the Supreme Court and under the Constitution. And I don't think we should scrap the Constitution and the legal standing and protection all the good legislation we passed to date has actually introduced. So I actually believe we need to... Practical things like electoral reform need to be changed. The Constitution only allows voting to take place on one day. We would like to have voting on a Friday and a Saturday over a 2-day period, so people are at work and they're at home.
Okay, and at what pace would you propose to make these changes? Because if you take, for instance, the referendum on children's rights, that has been in the pipeline for at least 2 years, 3 years maybe? Yeah,
it has, and that's a very good example of where you could have a constitutional referendum, make people happy, saying we're all in favour of children's rights, but then you don't...
No, but it's a very good example of something being promised and not delivered, is it not?
Well, the reason it wasn't delivered is because the Green Party pulled out of government 18 months before...
What about when it clashed with the Nice or the Lisbon referendum?
No. The Lisbon referendum was right to be dealt with on its own now, Lisbon too, and I can't make any apologies that the people voted the way they did on that one. And
okay, but would you not accept that if we're talking about a pace of reform, that there is a simple matter which has been on the long finger for quite some time, so why should people have faith that Fianna Fáil will make these changes as a matter of urgency?
I'll tell you why. Nobody knows better than, I think, Charlie is spokesperson on Children's Affairs for Fine Gael, and I'm a member of the Public Accounts. When the HSE themselves couldn't even answer how many children died in their care, constitutional reform and a children's referendum is a part, and not the major part. It's only a part. The reform of the HSE and how they deal with children in care is the biggest thing that needs to be done in this whole area, and a constitutional referendum won't affect children in care just because people vote unless we reform the HSE. So there are bigger issues as part of it, but it's not the fundamental issue.
Deputy Charlie Flanagan, take your political hat off for a moment and speak as a solicitor. The case is that 70 years of precedent and law has been built up based on the existing Bunnock na hÉireann. Now, to throw that out and introduce a new document is a legal risk.
Well, not only is it a legal risk, but it's a massive job. And I think there are many aspects of our Constitution that have served us well over the years. I would be anxious that we look at the portions of the Constitution that are causing some difficulty, particularly in relation to how the country is governed in terms of government and politics politics and institutions of state, perhaps the Dáil.
Okay,
I
so
would
to
look
be
at those.
clear, you're not talking about an entirely new document.
No. That would be a massive undertaking, and I'm not really sure if it's absolutely necessary. What we are doing is dealing with the portions of the Constitution that we believe have become outdated. Reference to the Senate, reference to the way in which the Dáil works, and if you like, the relationship between the legislature on the one hand and the courts on the other. Much of our law is actually being made now by the Supreme Court. That is because there's a defect in the system. I would like to see the Dáil doing that, and that's why I would like to see the Dáil working harder. I would like to see the Dáil working on a Friday, for example, and I would like to see the committee system becoming more enhanced and more powerful, that committees could undertake the type of investigations that we're currently farming out to tribunals in a way that's really not cost effective. I think we have wasted millions upon millions of euro and pounds on tribunals that haven't really resulted in good public practice, and that needs to change. I think
Can I ask you a question about where legislation should begin? And indeed, this is one for all three. But Charlie Flanagan first. At the moment, legislation seems to be drafted by civil servants. It then appears in the Dáil, and there's some argy-bargy and shouting about it, and invariably it's passed with maybe a few amendments. Where do you see the process starting? One
of my pet issues, and I say this having been opposition chief whip on 2 occasions, the Dáil should be the initial fountain of legislation. Over the years, the whipping system has ensured that any private members' bills, and in the last Dáil, I produced at least 3 private members' bills, all of which were shot down by the government for no other reason than we didn't have the numbers to actually pass them through.
Okay, I think that's Fine Gael not exercise the whip system in government.
Yeah,
I
would hope that would change, Will, and I say this as a parliamentarian without my political hat on. What we need to do is to bring about a situation where government is answerable to the Dáil. I would like, instead of civil servants drafting legislation, I would like to see ministers bring in legislation in draft form. Ask a committee to have a look at it and come back with all party recommendations. And in fairness to Sean Fleming, now he has been chair of a committee over the past number of years, and he has focused on forming consensus round his particular committees. I think if we could do that among all committees, we would see better legislation, more representative legislation, and ultimately less reliance on the court to decide.
Would you agree with that position, Paul Hogan?
I suppose I would agree with the merits that Charlie Flanagan is putting out here, but I suppose, I would be hopeful that every TD would be, able to introduce legislation to the House. I know that that's currently available, but the problem is that the arithmetic of the government can, suppress any piece of legislation that somebody tries to bring in, and that's about the operations of the Dáil. I know that the Seanad has virtually no powers in relation to, either amendments or introducing legislation also. So, on the one hand, the Seanad is totally unrepresentative, undemocratic, in my opinion, and that needs to be abolished in its current form. The powers of TDs then to introduce legislation is a separate matter, and again it needs a swift resolution so that every TD has the opportunity to, I suppose, affect the fundamental change that they aspire to introduce for the benefit of the community.
Sean Fleming, would you accept some of the flaws that have been articulated by your 2 opponents, that really governments, through the benefit of the whip system, don't allow the opposition any real input into legislation?
Yeah, I accept that that's generally the case. There are some ministers, and they're individual ministers, and it depends on the style and the character of the minister. I know Mary O'Rourke, when she was a minister, was always very amenable to opposition amendments if she felt they were a good idea. Other ministers, depending on the character, just stick by the civil servant advice and wouldn't actually accept an opposition amendment in case they felt there were implications they weren't aware of. So some of it does, but it needs to be better than that. And I actually think one item of legislation, one of the biggest ones that this Dáil passed, was the legislation setting up NAMA. The Minister of Finance published a draft discussion piece of legislation for about 3 months. Everybody had an input all over the country into that before then the bill was actually even brought into the Dáil to start with. That was an outstanding experience, and it can happen on major pieces of legislation. It actually can happen, and it requires a willingness of government ministers to do that. There is nothing preventing that, but we haven't seen enough of it.
I agree with that, and I think we could take it a stage further by looking at EU regulations, which are a source of most serious concern particularly to farmers. And one of the reasons is that we say TDs and senators say, well, listen, this is an EU regulation, our hands are tied. That should not be the case, Will, because if we have a beefed up EU scrutiny committee in the Dáil, we can get these regulations in draft form. We can highlight particular issues. If, for example, an EU regulation is designed for Germany and France, it mightn't necessarily be good for Ireland. We've seen too much of that. But a strong EU committee that can flag these difficulties coming down the tracks, that can be amended in our Parliament, that we can get back to Brussels and say, listen, this isn't on, change it, rather than what we're doing at the moment, wringing our hands and actually blaming Europe.
Okay, you're all getting along far too well. We want to talk about salaries and expenses because this has been raised by countless callers today. How much is a TD worth, Paul Hogan?
Well, I can only say from our own party that Sinn Féin only take home the average industrial wage, and the rest of the money is invested into providing a top-class constituency service. Within our manifesto, we want to cut ministers' salaries down to €100,000 and TDs' salaries down by 20%.
And what about the expenses regime?
The expenses, well, no expenses should be claimed that are unvouched. We're looking that all expenses are vouched. I believe that TDs and ministers and senators claim exorbitant expenses, and I believe that this is a matter that needs a resolution.
And the Taoiseach, how much should the Taoiseach be paid?
Again, I don't think that anybody in the public service should be paid over €100,000. It's absolutely crazy that taxpayers' money is going into this kind of payment of services.
Deputy Charlie Flanagan Fine Gael has set a limit that's double that amount.
Listen, I don't believe it's fair or reasonable for TDs to set their own salaries and pensions. Your initial question was, how much should a TD be paid? Everybody can have a different view on that. The point here is I don't think that I should set my own salary. And that's why I believe it should be linked.
You must have an idea of
Yes,
what you
of
feel
course.
you're
It
worth.
should be-
So what is that amount?
Well, we should be linked to the public service. And I think there's a rate
Give us
perhaps...
a number, please.
Well, I think at assistant principal level is not unreasonable, which is something in the region of between 80 and 90,000. I think that's not unreasonable. If we have a situation where TD's salaries are such that the job just doesn't pay, well, then we're going to have a real difficulty in attracting people who are in a position to provide a service to the people.
But that
You'll have
implies
people
that
from-
somebody who's on the average industrial wage would not be capable
No.
or intelligent enough to be
Not
a
at
TD.
all. It has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence, Will, and that is, an unfair implication. What it would do is you would have perhaps big business people or very well-off people who could decide to enter politics as a hobby, and I think that mightn't be in the best interest of the public. But my initial point, and let me make it again because I do believe there's a fundamental issue here, I don't think it's right that I should set my salary. I believe there should be a pay scale which broadly reflects a view of the people as to what we are worth. But it's perhaps unfair to ask me that because ultimately, I believe that I'm worth every cent I get. I run a fairly decent constituency operation. I make no apologies for that. It's there are expenses attached to the job, but ultimately I'm well paid. There's no
Okay.
doubt about it.
Sean Fleming,
I'm prepared to take a salary cut. I've no issue with it.
Thanks, Will. What I find the most contentious issue with the public and all of this is the expenses paid to TDs, right? And my suggestion, people will have heard me saying this once or twice or 3 times over the last few years. I have a clear view on this. The expenses is a big issue with the public. TDs don't need to get paid any expenses. It should be zero. And it's very simple as this. Charlie, every one of the 5 TDs in Laois Offaly provide their own offices to suit themselves. I believe the OPW should say to the new TDs elected in the Dáil, there's the local authority office, there's the Government of Midlands Department of Agriculture, Education or Finance. You're allocated your space in there for yourself and your staff and your facility. Go in there like everyone else.
Okay, what
Use
about
the-
travel expenses?
if you don't
phone
live
expenses?
near it,
No,
though, there's a problem.
and just let me say, and I believe the whole cost of running the constituency office should be part of the public service rather than TDs having to run an office, claim expenses, and people feel.
Okay, but either way, the taxpayer is still funding the
Yeah,
cost.
but it shouldn't be paid. The TDs shouldn't be claiming expenses, and that's what aggravates the public.
Yeah, but it's a matter of accounting then, really.
Well,
But-
that does the way it is at the moment aggravates the public, and that's why you've got so many calls on this issue.
Anyway, phones, travel expenses, the other matters that you're able to claim for, do you believe they should be zero as well?
No, we get the lowest public service rate. I think I get something like an old-fashioned money. I get something like 30 pence a mile or something like that is the rate.
I've been through the Fianna Fáil manifesto, by the way. There's no reference to reducing the salaries of TDs any further.
No, there's been a 25% reduction in salaries of TDs, and every TD who got their P60, like everyone else in the country, got the same shock. Like there's several public servants in County Laois paid much higher than the TDs in County Laois. There are several people in the HSE paid much higher than the Taoiseach is in Laois Offaly.
Yes, but you're still paid 3 times thereabouts the average
well,
industrial wage. So how do you reconcile that?
I will start to view that it's not on for public servants to be paid, and that includes senior people in the HSE and state board, figures in excess of 200,000.
Okay, but then that's deflecting from the issue. I mean, are you the L'Oreal TD because you're worth it? That's why you should be paid 3 times the amount of a person on the average industrial wage.
Not at all. I believe we should get the rate, which is a principal officer. I think it's 85,000 to put a figure on it, and that's approximately the figure what a TD gets. And it's the rate for a principal officer. It's several grades down from the top senior civil post.
Paul Hogan, you're shaking your head.
I am, and I suppose I was shaking my head at the first word that he used about the shock at opening his pay packet. Let him tell that to the low and medium income earners who are being hit and crippled with this USC charge. TDs in this country are being paid way too much. Expenses that some of our elected representatives are claiming are actually in excess of $1,200 a week. That's more than what people are earning by themselves. So,
but what about Charlie Flanagan's point that in order to make the job worthwhile, to attract quality, competent people, you need to have a reasonable salary?
Ridiculous.
And 70 to 80,000 is the figure.
Absolutely ridiculous. If people can't survive, and you had various senators coming out saying that, how would you survive on 65 grand a year? It's absolutely ridiculous. How do other people survive, on what is a good income? If we're claiming 32 grand a year as average, that RTDs are claiming 32 grand a year as the average industrial wage. But how are we surviving with?
But yet you don't, while you say you will accept that yourself, you don't propose in your document to reduce all TDs to 32 or 35,000 euro per year.
Yeah, but what we're saying is that all TDs' wages should be reduced. Absolutely,
but not to that level.
Well, what we're saying is that with the rest of the money, we provide a top-class constituency service, and that's what we invest in.
Okay,
putting in place the infrastructure for the community, and not just lining our own pockets.
Oh well, listen. I think part of the difficulty has been, and we've all been round this constituency and the Midlands now for some time on an intense election campaign. Undoubtedly, Will, this is a big issue. You know it. We know it. I think part of the difficulty, or perhaps the most important aspect, has been the severance pay and pensions for ministers, the golden handshakes. Fine Gael, Enda Kenny has said this on a number of occasions. We will abolish the severance pay for ministers. Another difficulty.
Effective when, by the way?
It'll be effective, I suppose, as soon as there's a change of government. If we get
within the first 100 days.
Well, listen, if we get in first, there's a huge stumbling block, which is next Friday, and that's why I'd be urging everybody to read the Fine Gael policies and support the Fine Gael policies.
On the assumption you are elected to government, that commitment to end these golden parachutes will be implemented within the first 100 days?
Oh gosh, I would expect that, Will. Now, I haven't a precise detail, but I would be disappointed to come back on your show, and I know, given the intense nature of debates emanating from this office, I would be disappointed if that initiative isn't undertaken. Okay. And I will ask you to hold me to account. Another issue has been the state cars.
I have to give the final word to Sean Fleming.
The ministerial cars is an issue.
To wrap up,
and indeed the government jet is an issue.
Just to wrap up and give everybody even time.
Yep.
Sean Fleming, this matter of so many ministers, including the Taoiseach himself, departing politics with a golden parachute, that has to make your job on the doorstep pretty difficult.
It has, and it is, and that's why I mentioned expenses and payments, and that has been mentioned.
Okay,
and
but again, there's no reference in your documents to addressing it.
Well, no, we've ordered a review of the ministerial cars, and it actually commenced about 2 months ago.
Okay,
and
but
that's be there as soon as the government comes in. And we are expecting the Garda Síochána who run those cars to say that there's no security risk for former ministers and the majority government ministers, and they shouldn't have a take.
Right, but the pension parachute remains, does it?
Yeah, no.